when Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel his people, and that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, and her 2 sons, of which the name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been an alien in a strange land. The name of the other was Eliezer, for the God of my father, said he, was mine help, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife unto Moses into the wilderness, where he encamped at the mount of God. And he said unto Moses, I, thy father-in-law Jethro, am come unto thee, and thy wife, and her 2 sons with her. And Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and did obeisance, and kissed him. And they asked each other of their welfare, and they came into the tent. Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done unto Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and all the travail that had come upon them by the way, and how the Lord delivered them. Jethro rejoiced for all the goodness which the Lord had done to Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord, who hath delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who hath delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, for in the thing wherein they dealt proudly, he was above them. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God, and Aaron came, and all the elders of Israel, to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. Now that's as far as we're going to read this evening. But I want to point out why fellowship is necessary, or the necessity of fellowshipping. And the first part of this chapter, it seems that for the last several months, Moses had been without his wife and children. Let's go back and backtrack just a little bit. If we remember, Moses lived in Egypt in the house of Pharaoh. He come of age when he realized that God wanted him to let his people go. He smote the Egyptian. Pharaoh went to seek his life. Moses fled. Remember that? And he fled into the wilderness. And I don't remember how many miles it was. I believe it's well over 100 miles and he finds himself in Midian. And there he meets Jethro. And the Bible said Jethro had a bunch of daughters. I couldn't remember how many it was. They saw 7 daughters. I think that's what sounds right. 7 daughters. And one of them's name was Zipporah. And he found her by the well, I think. So ladies, if you're looking for a man, hang out by the well, I guess. And so Moses married her. And here he was out one day on the backside of the desert and attending his sheep. And he saw that bush burning. And that was up on Mount Sinai, or the Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. And there God gives Moses his instruction to go back to Egypt to let his people go. And it seems at that point, Moses had his wife and children stay home with Jethro, the father-in-law, and Moses went to Egypt. So this whole time, Moses has been in Egypt, persuading Pharaoh to let God's people go. And Moses is alone in the sense that he doesn't have his wife with him. And he doesn't have his 2 boys with him. So, and we know that this went on for several months. This would put a great strain, a great hardship on anyone in that kind of situation. Just to remind you, look in chapter 4. Hold your place in chapter 18, but look in chapter 4. Exodus 4 and verse number 20. It seems to me that it's all the way back here that Moses had left his wife Zipporah in Exodus 4 and verse number 20. It says, Moses took his wife and his sons and set them upon an ass, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the rod of God in his hand. It seems somewhere around that time is when he told them, stay home with your daddy while I go and do what God wants me to do. But no doubt, while Moses was doing God's work in Egypt, there's no doubt he missed his wife. There's no doubt he missed his children. Jethro seemed like a nice guy, was his father-in-law. No doubt he missed him. Doesn't say anything about his mother-in-law. But he probably missed her too, right? But fellowshipping, what we're seeing here, fellowshipping, it's necessary, it's important, folks, because it allows us to build relationships. It not just build relationships, but it allows us to rebuild relationships. I mean, look at the verses here. Jethro comes in the first few verses. Verse 5 says, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, he came with his sons. The latter part of the verse says, he went to Moses where he encamped at the Mount of God. So Jethro comes to Moses and said, I'm your father-in-law Jethro. We're come to see you. My wife's come, or your wife's come, and her 2 kids. And so it's a time of just let's refresh ourselves, fellowship a little while, talk a little bit. How's it been? How's the weather back home? Things like that. It's important. It's just reasonable. As Moses looks out his tent and sees Jethro coming, he's 80 years old, but, maybe there's a little spring in his step to get to his wife. Maybe his boys come running to him. I don't know. But there was a reunion there. They were reuniting. They had been distant for a while. But notice what it says in verse number 7. It says, Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and did obeisance. Remember, Jethro, he's not just his father-in-law, but he's also a priest. He did obeisance, kissed him. They asked each other of their welfare. And they asked each other of their welfare. Fellowshipping is so important. It's necessary. Because it allows us the opportunity to care for others, for one another's needs. Moses asked Jethro, how are you doing? And Jethro would have told him how he's doing. Then Jethro asked Moses, well, how are you doing? And Moses would have told him how he's doing. We had fellowship dinner tonight. When you met somebody and greeted them this evening, did anybody say, well, how you been? How's your week been going? What have you been into? What's up? What's new? Anybody said it? I think that's how I greeted John. So, well, what have you been into? Wonderful time at work. So I just want to know. I just want to know what Brother John's been going through this week. And you know what? After he told me a little bit about his week, and he asked me about how things were going on my side, and I told him. So we were just fellowshipping, getting to know how each other's week has been going. Well, why do we do this? When you think about it, really, it's because there's a care and a concern for one another. And that's exactly what Jethro and Moses are doing. They asked each other of their welfare. That phrase, it says they asked each other. This is interesting. That means it was not a one-sided conversation. See what it says in verse 7? They asked each other of their welfare. Now, put yourself in Moses' shoes. You ever wanted to tell somebody something so bad it's just bubbling inside of you? Imagine you're Moses. Do you have anything that might be interesting to tell somebody that you haven't seen in a long time? Be hard for them to get a word in, right? Let me tell you, you won't believe what's happened. You wouldn't believe what the last 2 months have been like, Jethro. But it wasn't quite like that. they asked each other of their welfare. So there, it wasn't a one-sided conversation. Isn't that aggravating when you try to talk to somebody and you say a few things and this, but this, and then they go to tell you about themselves, and there goes the whole conversation, right? It's all about them until they got to go. People like that. Not being interested in the other person. Anyway, not laboring that point. That's how it was with Moses and Jethro. They cared for each other. But it also looks like, in verse number 7, that the last part of it, it says they asked each other welfare, but this is, and they came into the tent. So Jethro, he's got Zipporah, Moses' wife, and the two boys, and they come to see Moses. It looks to me like they all went into Moses' tent. Kind of be a little out of place if Moses said, wife, you stay out there, boys, you stay out there. Me and Jethro's going to talk. It could have happened. But the point I'm making is it looks like the fellowship included the whole family there. They came into the tent. I think it's important that children need to witness their parents fellowshipping with other believers in Christ, talking about the things of God. That's important. That parents, that your kids see you fellowshipping, talking with other people just about spiritual things of God. It's not all. It may be difficult, but it's not all about work. It's not all about the drama in your family or other things. It's not all about those things. There's some spiritual things to conversate about, to talk about. It's important that other people hear you, listen about that. But notice what else it says in verse number 8. And say fellowshipping, I think it's important, folks, because when you think about this, when you've got a group of believers coming together to fellowship, I think it's necessary, it's important, because it gives you the opportunity to brag about the Lord. Well, let me tell you what God's done. Let me tell you what God did last week. Let me tell you what the Lord did for me this week. Let me just tell you about how God blessed me just the other day. This morning, let me tell you, we woke up and me and God had such a sweet time of fellowship. And so you can conversate with another person bragging on how good God is. And when you look at verse number 8, that is exactly what Moses begins to do when he's talking to Jethro. Let's just look at this again in verse 8. Moses told his father-in-law, see this next word? All that the Lord had done unto Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake. But he didn't leave at that. It says, and all the travail that had, and there was some travail, right? That had come upon them by the way. So that means he's telling them about all the trouble they had since they left Egypt up until where they're at here. And here they're bragging on God, how the Lord delivered them. Let me just tell you about that. He told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done, all the travail, and how the Lord delivered them. Let me ask, could you imagine what it would have been like to sit in Moses' tent and hear him tell of all that God had done? I'd like to have been there. I'd have liked to have been a little boy, listen to my grandfather or my old dad or someone telling about what God had done. I'd think I'd pay money to be there. I'd love to be there. I can just imagine Moses. He's telling Jethro. Well, it said that all that the Lord had did. So that means he's telling Jethro. He said, Jethro, I haven't never seen anything like this before in my life. You would not believe the plagues that God brought to Egypt. And that Pharaoh, let me tell you, that man, I ain't never seen a man with a harder heart than that man, but God broke him down. And so Moses I'm just, trying to imagine how it could have been. Jethro, God he turned all the water in Egypt into blood. You would not believe how bad that place stunk. It was bad. Then there was flies everywhere. Let me tell you, there was locusts. Jethro, there was frogs everywhere. Horrible. And you know what? Pharaoh, God would have got rid of those frogs that night, but Pharaoh said, tomorrow. So, he's telling them all about the plagues. I'd love to have been there. The miracles that God had done. So Moses is able to tell Jethro about that Passover lamb. 2 million Jews. Could you, and we labored this several weeks ago. But can you imagine Moses explaining it to Jethro that God had provided a perfect lamb for every household? Jethro, there was a perfect lamb for every single household that wanted one. And Jethro, if you'd have been there, God would have had a lamb for you too. Just amazing. How God had them cross the Red Sea, how He turned the bitter waters of Marah into sweet, the manna every day. So He's telling Jethro all these things. I know I'm being a little silly here, but he might have said, no, Jethro, you just watch. Tomorrow morning, we'll go pick some manna. And listen, God's been leading us by a pillar of fire and a cloud by day. You see that cloud out there? That pillar of cloud, that's led us here. Or if it was evening, Jethro, do you see that pillar of fire? Look, it's right there. It'd have been amazing. And then when they get to he could have told them how it was in Meribah. Oh, Jethro, listen, the people there were ready to stone me to death. They were thirsty. We were in the desert, and God told me to smite this rock, and I smote that rock, and you know what happened? Water come out of that thing. So he's telling them all these things. And Jethro, just the other day, here we were, we're not soldiers, we're slaves. And we went to battle with the Amalekites, and you know what? God won that victory. So he's telling, I'd love to have been there. I sure would have. So fellowshipping is necessary because it lets you brag on God. Let me tell you what God's done. All right, real quickly, verse number 9. Fellowship is necessary. You know what it does? It gives joy to other people. Look in verse number 9. After Moses told Jethro all about these things, verse number 9 says, and Jethro rejoiced for all the goodness which the Lord had done to Israel. Jethro rejoiced. I like bragging on God. I know you do too. But have you ever been the recipient of someone bragging about God? They're bragging and they're telling you what all God's done for them. And you know what? This is what's amazing. They're telling you what God did for them, and you get excited about it. That's just the way it is. Moses is telling Jethro what God did for him, and Jethro's excited about it. He's rejoicing about it. This is what happens when believers fellowship. It's what should happen. They brag on God. Others rejoice about it. It's just good stuff. It is. Verse number 11. Fellowship's necessary because it brings praise to God. Look what it says in verse 10, rather. And Jethro said, here it is, blessed be the Lord. He's just blessing God. Blessed be the Lord, who hath delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians. And notice what it says in verse number 11. Jethro says, now I know. And I don't know if he's saying that he doubted it before, but he's just, now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods. I'm telling you, God is God's what he's saying. He's worshiping, he's just praising God. And this is Jethro, and he wasn't even there. This is all what happened when they were fellowshipping. But here's the last one. Look in verse number 12. And I appreciate this. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. And Aaron came and all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law. And look what it says in the last part of that verse. Before God. I think fellowship's important and it's necessary because it brings believers together in worship before the Lord. Real fellowship should do that. When we look at verse number 12, Jethro made a sacrifice. You know, I think it's reasonable to say that real fellowship requires a sacrifice. You know, you folks that were here for fellowship dinner tonight, you had to sacrifice something to be here at 6 o'clock rather than 7 o'clock. What were some things you had to sacrifice to be here? What were some things you had to sacrifice to be here at 6 o'clock this evening? Time. Some of y'all could have stayed in bed. You got together real slow. Missed out on that late afternoon nap. So you sacrificed your time. What's something else that you might have sacrificed to have fellowship here tonight? Plans? Time to cook. There we go. That's a big one. So it cost you money. It cost you some of your substance. It cost you things you had to cook. Well, what do you do it for if it cost you all this stuff? It should be a blessing. It should be a blessing. That's right. So sacrifice was made. Fellowship will cost you something. Food, in verse 12, food was prepared. Fellowshipping may require, here's a big one, work and planning. Somebody's got to put these things together. But notice in verse number 12 that God's presence was enjoyed. God's presence was enjoyed. It says that Aaron came, all the elders of Israel, to eat bread. There we said there's no eating, there's no meeting, right? To eat bread with Moses' father-in-law, and here it is before God. So Jethro the priest's there, all the elders of Israel there, Aaron's there, Moses is there, the family's there, and God's there. That'd have been just the best meeting ever, wouldn't it? Fellowship with one another. They got food. God's there in their presence. That's just good. That's just good. That's about as far as I think we're going to go this evening on that subject of fellowshipping. But necessity of fellowshipping. It's important. Fellowshipping is necessary, folks, because it allows us to build relationships with one another. It's necessary because it allows us the opportunity to express our care and concern for one another. We get to pick up on, when we're fellowshipping, do your ears ever perk up when you hear about someone else's needs? Yeah. And so something in your heart says, you know what, I'd like to help that person. Fellowshipping allows that. Fellowshipping is necessary because it gives us that opportunity or that chance to brag on the Lord. Fellowshipping is necessary. It gives joy to others. Fellowshipping is necessary because it brings praise to God. And I believe it's also necessary because it brings believers together in worship to God. All right, let's stand and we'll dismiss in prayer this evening.